morning. You want to take a seat? We will be in 1 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to start in verse 8. Try to get to the end of the chapter. Sprint to the finish line in the next few, hopefully. We'll see. So one thing we learned, starting in verses 1 through 7, what we covered last week. One thing we learned is that section, chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, the qualifications or qualities of elders, is that reputation is more important than abilities or gifts. I don't know if you noticed that. I tried to bring it up, but there was only one thing that really was focused on the abilities of elders, and the rest of it was on who the man is and his reputation. The personal integrity of the man and his own spiritual maturity was of higher importance than his skills or his abilities. And as we get into this study of deacons, I think we're going to notice that a lot of these qualities overlap. And it's going to point to the same thing. The focus remains on the reputation and the integrity of the man rather than just his skills. Now, I think it's at least interesting to ask why that would be. Why would it be more important for his reputation to be good? And why would Paul not just talk about skills the whole time? Well, you're a representative of the church. And you're a man who leads. And so if you're going to lead, then you must accurately represent the church and who the church is supposed to be. So reputation is crucial. It's crucial to spreading the gospel, our overall goal, right? Well, if you're known to be greedy, the church, at least to the one perceiving, is known to be greedy. And many people will leave the church because they've been hurt by bad, selfish leaders, resulting in them blaming both God and the church for their hurt. Well, was it God's fault? No. And yet, it doesn't matter how skilled the guy is, he is blamed for the failure. God is blamed for the failure of leaders, no matter how skilled they are, who make decisions that don't coincide with these qualities that we have studied last week and that we'll study again today. So it's crucial that men make these decisions and are men who will naturally decide things based on these qualities. All right, so a deacon. Verse 8. A deacon. We see this in Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, that there is this office of deacons and elders. Paul starts his letter by saying that. A deacon is one who's designated by the elders to a specific ministry. Essentially, they're assistants to the overseers. They operate by the authority of the eldership in their designated task. And this word in Greek can mean kind of a broader group than just the office, because it means servant or minister or sometimes even teacher. However, just because one is called a deacon in the text does not mean that they are a deacon. In reference to this specific office that we're about to discuss, Phoebe is the most obvious example of that in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. So in this text, Paul is writing about the actual office of deacons, men who are designated to fulfill a specific task. Now, I don't believe that I really have to say this because this should be our goal every time we come to the text, but I'll preface with this, that if you are a deacon or a deacon's wife, we'll get there, just as I know the elders did last week as we studied through the text that's focused on qualities and qualifications of elders, I encourage you to reflect on yourself as we go through these descriptions. Are we living up to the design that God has for His church? Is there somewhere we may be lacking? And hopefully this is something, of course, like that we all will do naturally when we come to the text, even charting back to chapter 2, verse 8, with how men are to pray and moving forward. But these lists here at the beginning of chapter 3 and where we are now are not simply just lists of qualifications, but things that those holding the positions are to uphold. And those who do not hold these positions are striving for. If we are not a deacon or a deacon's wife, then we are striving for these qualities, just like we talked about last week with elders and their qualities and qualifications. These lists act as mirrors for us to compare ourselves in our lives. Are these qualities things that we are striving to produce and develop? And if we are a deacon or a deacon's wife, do we possess these? Are we qualified? Let's begin in verse 8. Deacons, likewise, must be men of dignity, not double-tongued or addicted to much wine or fond of sordid gain. Now, first thing we're going to look at is the word likewise. This connects us back. Whenever we see a therefore, likewise, anything like that, we're going to look backwards. Well, likewise has already been used once. We're connecting back really to verses like 1 and 2, where Paul says this is how it's supposed to be. He starts with the elders, deacons. So he says, likewise, deacons likewise are supposed to hold these qualities. Now, first one is they must be men of dignity. Now, I think I mentioned this like every class. I use the New American Standard from 1995. And it just so happens that they chose to translate this word, which is really just one word, men of dignity. I think they might take some liberties there by saying men of dignity, because literally the phrase is translated deacons, likewise, dignity, or dignified. And so we kind of carry over a must be. Anyways, that's beside the point. The translators pick up the must be, that's important, and it's fine from verse 2. But the qualification that they are men are not in this specific phrase. Now we're going to get there, where we see that they are men. But I don't think that we can pull the men of dignity when your translation probably doesn't say that. I think ESV doesn't, and several others don't. And New American Standard was actually kind of in the minority of ones that say men of dignity, which is usually doesn't usually happen. Usually New American Standard doesn't take too many liberties. But this time they did. I don't really prefer it because I'd rather just get with the text as close to what we can get in the text. We will see later, though, that men are to be deacons. And so it's not like we're just throwing that out the window. We're just saying maybe that's not here. But the term dignified, or reverence, yours might say, is used in chapter 2, verse 2 to describe the dignified, respectable lives of the people, and in chapter 3, verse 4 to describe how elders should parent their children with all dignity. And this is an inward quality that is seen in the man's behavior. We're talking about men who are worthy of respect from those around them. And it's important to note that these qualities are about the man himself wherever he goes. This is not limited to only how the man is seen within the church, but who the man is. So after this quality, we get 3 prohibitions. One is, he must not be double-tongued or not deceitful. You'll notice in quotes I put like deceitful above it. I try to include, your translation might say this, just so we can all kind of be on the same page. But not double-tongued or deceitful. A deacon is not one who says one thing to one person and another thing to another person. This quality is one that is damaging to any relationship or community because it breaks trust. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 3 really touches on this idea. A person who has this quality is a threat to the church, and they can't hold a leadership position. You break trust. Okay, so not addicted or devoted to much wine. Now, this is very similar to the prohibition that we see of men who are not drunkards from chapter 3, at the beginning of verse 3, with elders. These men cannot be known as men who devote themselves to wine. It would ruin their reputations for others to see them as men who lack self-control. And though this phrasing is a little bit different between the descriptions of elders and the descriptions that we get here of deacons in regard to their relationship to alcohol, there appears to really be no difference in application, if you think about it. I've heard some people kind of make a little bit of a deal out of this, but is a person who is not a drunkard, is that not the same as not being addicted or devoted to wine? Regardless of if much is in there or not, it's the same thing, right? We're talking about men who are not drunk or not known to be drunk. They have self-control in how they conduct themselves in all things. So neither of them are drunkards. Neither of them can be addicted or devoted to much wine. They both have self-control. All right. And they cannot be fond of sordid gain, or yours might say, not greedy for money. And look, this is a characteristic of the false teachers. We had that verse on the screen. This is frowned upon in all Greco-Roman society, but we talked about this last class, so we're going to move on. Verse 9. But holding to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Or yours might say, but having the mystery of the faith with a clear or pure conscience. This is a qualification that, look, it is expected of all Christians. And this is another reminder of these are things that we're all striving for, right? But this is expected of all Christians, but it's especially important for church leaders. Because of the false teachers who are distorting the gospel in Ephesus, it's crucial that those who are leading these specific ministries are holding to what they know to be true. They're holding to the mystery of the faith. Well, what is the mystery? Well, initially we see the content of the mystery is faith. But Paul is describing God's plan for all people to be saved through Christ. Paul is describing God's plan of salvation as a, quote, mystery. And it's pretty common for him to do, right? This is not exclusive to this letter at all. However, it does denote that God's plan was a secret for those who did not or do not know him. And we see that with how even Jesus describes his teachings in parables, right? He says, some are going to be inside of the kingdom and they'll understand what those parables mean. Those outside the kingdom won't understand. And that's the goal. And then Paul describes the gospel as the mystery frequently throughout his letters. This is a mystery, though, that has been revealed, and it's revealed through Christ. But false teachers don't know God. And so Paul is charging deacons to hold on to what they know amidst the falsehoods that are going on around them, and they're to do so with a clear or pure conscience, instead of being ethically or morally flawed like the false teachers. Paul expects that men who are to be deacons should be sincere Christians with clear consciences. Verse 10. These men must also first be tested. Then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. They've got to be tested. Talk about that first. This is not some new unspecified test. This is not the elder saying, all right, here's your piece of paper. We've got 10 questions. How are you going to handle these situations? All right, you passed or you failed. This is not that. This is looking at the man's life. The man's life is the testimony that's needed. You're being evaluated. Do you fit these descriptions? Are you a man of God? Do you coincide with what we already know deacons should be? And if so, then you've been proven beyond reproach. You passed the test. And we talked about this a lot last week, so we're not going to go into it into detail. But it's beyond reproach or blameless. If his life is consistent with these qualities, these descriptions that are being discussed, determined after testing, he is found without blame. He's eligible to be a deacon. Oh, I didn't put these little notes on the screen. All right, verse 11. Women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate and faithful in all things. All right, there's a lot to talk about here. This verse presents us a challenge. The qualities that these women are to have creates no issue, and we'll talk about the qualities in a moment. It's who this is addressed to. So we've talked about this before, but the word for women is also the same word for wives. And when we were talking about this just a few verses ago in chapter 2, we were saying, well, this is to women and applies to all women, and here's a bunch of reasons why, and we spent a really long time on that, if you remember. Well, now we kind of have a similar issue. Who is this addressed to? And we're not going to take quite as long as we did last time we talked about this, but it's important to talk about. Because the New American Standard chose women. Okay, but if you have, let's see, I've got it on my notes. Translations are divided. If you have the ESV, the King James, the New King James, and a few others, yours says wives or their wives, to make it very clear we're talking about deacons here. Or yours might say women. The American Standard, New American Standard, the NIV, the NRSV, a bunch of others. Choose women. It's more general. And so one thing about translations is that you've got to make a choice on things like this. So these translations decide on what they think is best grammatically, and then they'll most likely include like a little note. If you have your Bible open, you might see a little number or something, and it's going to take you to a little place that says, or women, or wives, most likely. Because translations have to make a decision, but if they're good, then they want to kind of give the option to you to study on your own and figure it out. So they say, it could also mean this. You can figure that out on your own. So they're trying to be honest, but you got to decide. Now, there can be some major implications on the application of the text, depending on which one you choose. If we're talking about wives here, then Paul is referring to the wives of deacons and maybe elders and their qualifications or qualities. He could also be referring, like I just said, to elders' wives. Now, if women, then Paul is referring to the separate office of deaconesses, which is, some translations will go ahead and toss that in there. That's a dishonest translation. But they'll say that, or we could be talking about female deacons, or if women was intended, then it wasn't necessarily to talk about women in leadership as much as just a general view of women and maybe some women who are working in the church. And if you're working in the church, you should fit this description. So, what's the answer? Now, the best way to find answers is to look in the context. Looking around in chapter 3, now this is a question for you. Hopefully your Bibles are open. Looking around in chapter 3 and knowing what you know about what Paul's doing in this chapter, maybe even keeping in mind what we talked about in chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, what are some things that you notice that might help us find answers in chapter 3? What is Paul, do you think Paul is talking about wives or women, and what in the chapter is going to help us figure that out? It could be something really specific or something general.
We haven't got there yet, verse 12.
Right.
So I would assume, unless this is advocating certain types of relationships, I would assume that would be the wives of the deacon.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Greger brings up a good point, is look in the next verse, where it says, well, the deacon must be husband of one wife. This is also a qualification of an elder. We're going to get there here in a second. So Paul goes straight from wives, you need to be this way, you need to fit these qualities. Now deacons, you need to be the husband of one wife. Okay, and so that gives us some context of Paul's been talking about wives. Now, it's important to talk about that Paul has not been void of discussing wives in this chapter already. He's done it really a fair amount, sometimes really obviously and sometimes implicitly within the text. But it's very obvious that if you're a leader of the church, it is important to have a good and godly wife. Both offices must be husband of one wife, and though she is not mentioned in verse 5 of chapter 3, though she is not mentioned, we know that the wife bears some responsibility in the household, right? In managing the household. She's got responsibility there as well, and ensuring that the household is run well, which is a qualification of an elder. And so based on Paul's emphasis on the role of women in the home in this letter alone, in chapter 2, verse 15, and chapter 5, verse 14, we can see how important it is for women to be working in their household and ensuring that it is run well. Of course, this is ultimately the responsibility of the husband in the home, but the wife is not void of that responsibility either, and I think it is certainly present in this chapter. Okay, so we've already talked about wives some. Is there anything else you can notice? Yeah, definitely. And so for deacons, he says, and we'll get there here when we get to the next verse, but he says you've got to not only manage your household well, but he begins this time, and the last time I think Paul flipped it when he was talking about elders. But this time he says, deacons, husband of one wife, and you need to manage your children and your household well. Okay, and so of course we see that with deacons, and I think that there's absolutely the responsibility of the wife in this as well. Okay, so there's some other things we can note. Well, one, this chapter, this is a very general one here. This chapter is about leadership. It would not be fit for Paul, within this section on deacons, to note that all women should possess these qualities. Like this is, he's been talking about leadership. It wouldn't really make sense for him to say, oh, but by the way, one verse that says all women need to possess these qualities. Okay, back to leadership. So we can kind of rule out, like this is just Paul talking about all women. Well, we can also note that Paul has just talked about women not taking leadership roles in the church in chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, right? And the role of a deacon carries with it the authority from the elders. Therefore, it would be out of place for Paul to then note that women who desire to be deacons take a role of leadership here should fit certain qualifications, because he just stated that they possess a different role in the church and it is not one of leadership, chapter 2. So it wouldn't really make much sense for him to get into chapter 3 and say, oh, but by the way, women, if you want to hold this office of leadership, you need to have these qualities. Disregard what I said just a few sentences ago. That would make no sense. So the sentence structure in verse 4, this is another thing you might have noticed if you were really reading critically. This is a harder one. But the sentence structure in verse 2 and 8, where Paul begins the list for elders and deacons, is similar to what we see here in verse 11. You've got elders. This is how you should live. Elders must be this. You've got deacons, likewise, must be this. Well, now you've got verse 11, women, likewise, must be dignified. So the sentence structure is all true. And it's true that this, along with that usage of likewise, it denotes kind of a change of address. Like we're addressing someone new here. And even a change of position. Now, some people will look at this and say, now see, we're talking about a whole new office. Because Paul's referencing someone completely different here. We're not talking about deacons anymore. And I would say, well, that's true. We're not talking about deacons. But we are talking about a new person that is addressed, a new position here. But Paul appears to just be referring to the wives of deacons. This is a new position. They're not deacons, but they are the wives of deacons. And so, like I said, some will use this to say, like, well, we're talking about deaconesses here. This is a whole new position, but that's just not within the text. And so while it's still within the same list here, we're talking about overall the qualities and the qualifications of deacons, and we're continuing it in verse 12. This whole list focuses on deacons, but Paul includes this one verse in the middle that discusses the one wife who is to be married to that potential deacon. It's a new position in regard to like what we're addressing. Now we're talking about wives for just a second. This is in order for Paul to reference another group, but it still pertains to the overarching position of deacon. Now, quickly, it's worth noting that in defense of the whole female deacon, deaconess thing, I put a little note on this on the screen, but the phrase deaconess or the word deaconess didn't pop up in Christian writing until 230 AD. And we have a lot of Christian writing before that, which means must not have been a very relevant or a common thing. Almost like the office didn't exist until much later in time when they came up with it. That's beside the point. So there's much more that we could discuss with this whole women or wives thing, but I think we can pretty comfortably establish that Paul is referring to wives without digging too far into the weeds. Now, we still have the question, are we only talking about wives of deacons? After all of this study, it seems that in reference to that Paul is referencing the wives of deacons, and yet we typically, when we read this text, this whole text, we apply it to the wives of elders as well. And so I'll ask you, is there anything that you see in the text or anything that you know that could help you answer? Is Paul only referring to the wives of deacons? Why or why not? Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah, that's... Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Ms. Nell brings up the point that these are qualities or qualifications that we're all striving to meet, right? Of course, both men and women. Okay, so anything else that you may notice, and then we'll discuss a few things. We're talking about just deacons' wives or elders and deacons' wives?
I would vote for voting we compare the lead-in to these verses along with what also Titus about elders. This is an elder is an older person, and the qualifications, hospitable, able to teach, all those things are in there with their household and everything. I think it would be assumed, or it would be okay to interpret that if an elder and their wife have been together that long, that they have a lot of these things in place that's evident by what's laid on the shoulders of the man. When we're dealing with deacons, we tend to look at them, they don't have the same air quote age requirement that an elder would have, just by the name. So I think maybe some additional information, because these are younger families, making sure that the men are doing what they need to be doing, and that women are respectable as to where they are in that stage of life. So I would vote that this may be specific to deacons, but I would also qualify that by saying it does not appear to exclude elder life.
Right, right. And so what Dr. Greger just said is to sum it up with basically just the last sentence, because that was a lot of words. What he basically just said, and I appreciate all of them, what he basically just said is that he votes for voting, and his vote is that this is specific to deacons' wives, but maybe there is a need for that, and maybe that need is elders and their wives have been together much longer, and they've already developed these qualities, and Paul is addressing a specific thing with a younger couple or family, and saying, deacons' wives, you need to be striving for these qualities with the assumption that elders and your wives already have them. Okay, so let's talk about that. That's a good thought, so let's talk about these things. All right, so stick with me. We're going to cover here's what we know, here's some things we can guess, and then here's some really practical stuff that we're all probably already thinking. Paul only gives the command for wives amidst the list of deacons. Okay, now just speculating here. If Paul really wanted to be very clear, he could have said, elders, deacons, also all of your wives. But instead he just says wives. Okay, so he still could be referring to both, but it's within the list of deacons, right? So there's nothing in the section about elders that explicitly gives qualifications or qualities for elders' wives. Now, Paul could only feel, kind of going to Dr. Greger's point, Paul could only feel the need to address deacons' wives for a variety of reasons. And here are a couple of potential reasons. One is, deacons' wives might be more likely to be hands-on in the work of their husbands, since the role of deacons in the church, especially in Ephesus, was care for widows and care for the poor, something that their wives could jump right in on. And it certainly appears to be expected that the wife of a deacon is also involved, if she can be, in the work of the church, right? Like she is involved in helping her husband in some way if she can, especially if the work of her husband is applicable for her, right? And so the wives of elders cannot be quite as active in some of the key tasks of elders, such as exhorting and correcting the flock, right? Because what we just talked about at the end of chapter 2, with wives taking authority positions and teaching. So it's possible that their role in assisting husbands, deacons' wives here, elders' wives, does not require these specific qualities and qualifications that you absolutely must have. Now, I don't think that this is the whole answer, but I think that there is some truth in it, especially regarding the women in helping their husbands work when applicable as Christians who are working together. Now, it's also possible that Paul is addressing a specific issue. Now, some people will say that you've got false teachers who have made these inroads with women in the church, and that's absolutely true. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 6, verses 11 through 15 of the same chapter. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. We see that this is true, that false teachers have made inroads within some of the women of the church. And so Paul could have felt that some of the wives of these deacons were kind of disqualifying their husbands because of their bad reputations and character. And it was causing their husbands to not be above or beyond reproach. Therefore, Paul is addressing a specific issue that might not have been as relevant for the wives of elders in the church, maybe because they've already reached the qualifications of elders. These people have been together a long time, kind of pointing to what Dr. Greger said. And so it's not necessary for Paul to say, hey, by the way, you need to be this, even though you're already being this and you've been that for 20 years. Okay, now, thinking practically here, it seems only logical to assume that if wives of deacons are to be worthy of respect, gracious in their speech, and self-controlled, and faithful or trustworthy, then it would be expected of the wives of elders as well, since the office of elder is a higher office. It goes without saying that the wife of an elder must have good character and avoid slanderous language. It's obvious that if an elder's wife is, for example, a malicious slanderer, she's going to damage her husband's reputation, putting him under reproach. He is no longer qualified now. And it hurts the credibility of the entire eldership if the wife of an elder is, for example, a malicious slanderer. if the wife of an elder is not worthy of respect as a representation of her husband, one could bring reproach upon her husband for not being respectable either. Well, if your wife's not worthy of respect, the elder isn't either. And this might not be as obvious for the office of deacon, but a deacon's wife must also be worthy of respect for him to fulfill his duties as an assistant to the overseer. So while elders' wives in this passage do not have specific qualifications, it seems, one can notice qualifications of elders' wives within the qualities and qualifications of elders. You can look in the list and see the most obvious example being, well, there's a couple. One, is he beyond reproach? Well, if so, that certainly means that his wife is worthy of respect and not speaking slanderously of others and all of these other things, because that would immediately bring reproach to her husband. Okay, so that is the most umbrella term, beyond reproach. But a very obvious one, and we've already talked about it, is, can a household be managed well by a husband if his wife is not worthy of respect? If she does not care for her household or children, or if she does not respect her husband, can the husband have a good reputation among all and have a well-run household? Well, the obvious answer is no. And Brian brought up to me a good point last week after class that the reason it's so important, or one reason, it's so important for a man to already be running his household well and for his household to be moving and running well already before becoming an elder is because you're going to be out of the house more, doing the work of an elder. And so it's important that it's already being run well. And I always thought that's something I would have never thought of. So thanks for bringing that up. But how do you think that's going to be done when you're out of the house? Well, you have a wife, a helpmeet. You've got someone who's going to help you in the responsibility of that role. And so any serious assessment of a prospective elder will include an assessment of his wife and children, verses 4 and 5. Therefore, whether Paul meant for these qualifications for wives here to extend to the wives of elders, or if he was just addressing something that's specifically happening amongst the wives of deacons, we can know that these qualities also must be possessed by the wives of elders. It's kind of just natural. At the very least, if it's not a command by Paul for elders' wives, it is certainly a natural assumption that we must uphold, that elders' wives must be worthy of respect and not slanderers or slanderously malicious gossips, you might say. And they've got to be self-controlled and they've got to be faithful in all things, or else their husband wouldn't be qualified. Okay, so there's some kind of obvious parallels there. Now, let's very quickly go through some of these qualities for wives and what they share, and what we're going to see is that they share in a lot of the qualities with elders and deacons. They must be dignified. Now, we've talked about this already. There's the first list on the quality for deacons, and same with wives. And it refers to her respect and her reputation in the community around her. Must not be malicious gossips or deceitful or slanderers. It is the same term, actually, that is translated the devil in verses 6 and 7 because of the function of the devil, the accuser. Remember in Revelation, the accuser of the church? This usage just kind of implies that this woman is one who cannot be speaking lies or slanderous. Okay, so temperate or self-controlled. She also must avoid drunkenness. Faithful in all things, which is likely just a catch-all for her reputation. She is considered to be faithful in all things, and some might say trustworthy in all things. And this similar ideas here of she is faithful in all things, and her trustworthiness and her reliability is rooted in the fact that she adheres to the gospel. She's faithful to her God and to her children and to her husband. She's faithful in all things that she does. So, this is the qualifications or qualities that the wives of deacons and elders need to possess. Verse 12. Deacons must be husbands of only one wife and good managers of their children and their own households. Now, we've talked about this just a second ago, and really already a fair amount, and we've talked about it with elders as well. Like with elders, we are called to evaluate the children and household of deacons because that reflects the man clearest. Now, quickly, I think it's at least worth considering that to manage one's household well in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, carries a similar meaning to what we already talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, right? It's almost the same exact phrase between qualifications of elders and that of deacons. Now, we talked about what that looks like in detail last week, so I'm not going to belabor that of what it looks like for elders, but you likely remember or already know. But one thing that I had not before considered is, and this is kind of here's a Nate thought, and I'm going to move on and let you think about it too. One thing that I had not considered before was whether or not the faith of the children of deacons is necessary to consider. So let's talk about that for a second. One, we've got similar phrasing between the verses, right? In verses 4 and 5 is a very similar phrasing to what we get in verse 12. And we may not be as willing to evaluate the faith of the children of elders if we didn't have Titus chapter 1, verse 6. Because in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, all we really get is that children need to be submissive to their fathers. Let's see, 4 and 5. The elder must be one who manages his own household well, what we get with deacons, keeping his children under control or submissive with all dignity. And then this text, but if a man doesn't know how to manage his own household well, how will he take care of the church of God? Well, we could maybe do it, but it would be a bit harder to say, well, this includes having faithful children, if it wasn't for Titus chapter 1, verse 6, which says his children need to be faithful. And that's all we need to know. We can kind of piece the dots together, and we know it. Paul in Titus comments on his qualifications here. And so that's how we know for sure that it's necessary for elders to have faithful children. Well, deacons don't get this similar list of qualifications in Titus, like elders do. So, should we assume that because deacons is the same phrase, right? They've got to manage their children and household well. Should we assume that they're held under the similar standard that deacons are in their children and their household regarding the faithfulness of their children, since that's what Paul intends, right? In verses 4 and 5. He intends really to say that, and he comments on it in Titus to make us extra sure elders need to have faithful children. Well, then in Timothy, he uses the same phrase to say deacons must also have their household run well, and their children need to be managed well also. Something to consider. All right, now verse 13. For those, this is the last verse that we'll get about deacons. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing and a great confidence in the faith that is in Jesus Christ. Those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing, or an honorable standing, a good standing. Paul concludes this list in the same way he started it in chapter 3, verse 1, by saying an elder, one who desires to be an elder, desires a noble work. Those who serve well as deacons fill an honorable role, and they obtain a great confidence or boldness or assurance, which I think could be interpreted in a couple of ways. It could be your faith and your relationship with God is strengthened and deepened because of the work that you're continually doing and the qualities that you continue to produce, the fruits of the Spirit that you continue to produce. Now, some also interpret this, which I think is interesting, as if you are this kind of man and you are continually doing this kind of work, then you obtain a greater confidence when it comes to, or boldness, when it comes to being able to tell others about the gospel. Doors open, and you have a greater boldness in talking to them, which is often how boldness is considered, right? The boldness to be able to tell others. So, either way, we see the benefits of serving well as an elder. Now, what we get here is Paul's purpose statement, verses 14 through 16. I'm writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long. But in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of truth. After he writes these lists, he gives us his purpose. In verse 14, he says, I'm writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long, but just in case I'm delayed, I'm going to tell you this, so that, and there's your purpose statement, so that you'll know how to conduct yourselves as ones who belong to the household of God. Paul's been laying out multiple instructions regarding the attitudes of men and women, the classes of wealth, gender roles, and offices, all within the authority that he has from God. He is simply the messenger of the architect who has already designed the church. And he's not outlining details for man's households or husbands or wives necessarily, but how men and women should act in the household of God. There is a way in which God's people should live and has been designed for us, and it's not just a set of rules or qualifications, but a manner of living that we should conform ourselves to. Paul is relaying the blueprints, sometimes focusing specifically on that which is not going according to God's blueprint. But Paul writes to say, if you are going to be a child within the household of God, you should conduct yourself as one who has been given instruction from God himself. He says, the household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of truth. So Paul switches the metaphor from the household of God to the structure of the house, what he built, the church. So when God is called the living God, there's always some significance to it, and it's always rooted in an Old Testament idea. And there's several verses that we can see how it kind of has some different nuances and flavors. But what we're talking about, I think, in this instance, Paul is more likely pointing to the reality of God being with his people. And I have some verses on the screen that kind of point to that when God is called the living God in the Old Testament and what that means. It means that God's with you. Specifically in Joshua, where he says, the living God is with you, and that's how you know you can defeat all of these enemies. And he gives your list. Well, in this instance, he's saying that we belong to the church of the living God who is with us. We have a unique identity as the church, as people who belong to the living God who is still active and who still cares for the lives of his people. And we're given a function, the pillar and support or buttress of the truth. And not only does the church have a unique identity, but we have a unique function. In other places, the church is described as a building with a different purposes and oftentimes expressing the fact that it was built on Jesus as our foundation. And in this instance, Paul doesn't really talk about our foundation. And instead, he talks about our function, pillars and supports or buttresses. They're just architectural terms. We're still talking about a structure here. And they're referring to things that assist in structural support. They work together to ensure that the building doesn't fall. And God describes us, the church, as those who work to ensure that the truth does not fall. With the threat of a false gospel, Paul emphasizes the function of God's people, which is to uphold what is true to those who pervert the truth to those around them. It is the entire function. It is the function of the entire church. And when you look through what Paul has been discussing in all of chapters 2 and 3 through that lens, it really changes how you read his instructions. We're not talking about advice. We're studying God's design, the truth, and it's crucial that we uphold it. And that's why it's so important what the image and the reputation of the church is, and I think that it brings these qualifications into a very serious light. Holding an office like an overseer or deacon or the wives of both is a God-given responsibility that you answer to God for. And these qualities or qualifications came from the mind of God and are his design for his church. So not only do men hold these positions, not only do they need to take these qualities and qualifications seriously, but their wives do as well. And none of this is easy because it requires critical testing and introspection. But if that's what it requires, then it's what it requires to ensure that we are fitting God's design. And it also places pressure on those who are appointing. You know, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22, Paul encourages Timothy, be careful who you lay hands on. Why? Because not everyone may be fit for that ability, and Timothy is accountable for it. I think in a similar vein, it's up to us, the church, and our leaders, to ensure that we are all abiding by God's design for the church, namely, that our leaders are meeting the qualifications that God's prescribed. In verse 16, we're not really going to cover it, but in verse 16, Paul follows his purpose statement by this confession of faith and a hymn there at the end, and he says, this is the mystery of godliness, and the general idea is that Jesus came to earth, he was raised from the dead, we proclaim it to the world, this is the function of the church, and now Christ has been taken up in glory, and he is exalted on high. Now that leads us into chapter 4. That is all. Let me know if you have any questions or comments.